Hello and welcome back to our next video where I'm going to be talking about neutral witnessing. Okay, so in the process of awakening to reality, we did a little meditation in there about just becoming the witness. And we did it in the context of witnessing our feelings and learning how to witness our feelings from a place where we could see them as not being who we are. Right? That we can start to see them as just messengers, as just a part of an experience that we're having versus a thing that's coming to like destroy our lives or that is taking over who we are or is all of who we are or is this big kind of monster or any of these things. And then we worked into, right, getting the message from the emotions and the feelings and all that stuff. And hopefully that's something that you're practicing in your life on a regular basis now, that you have as a skill set and as something that you use for that. And then we also worked a lot on developing that compassionate witness, that part of yourself that can witness your pain or your experience or your thoughts or your emotions or any of these things, and how you can use that witnessing as a compassionate, I accept you, I love you, there's nothing wrong with you, this isn't your fault, what do you need right now? And again, those two things are very important in terms of validating ourselves, in terms of being able to be there for ourselves, in terms of being able to actually figure out what we're feeling or what we're wanting or what's hurting or any of these things, because when we feel loved, when we feel validated, when we feel safe, that's often when our consciousness expands and we can understand things, right? But when we're feeling like I shouldn't be feeling this way or we're afraid about what we're feeling or we feel alone or isolated or whatever, we can just be in this state of kind of, it's almost like we're feeling like we're treading water versus being able to gain ground. So we have these tools, hopefully we're using them, the observation, the witnessing, all of this. From here, in this work, another huge part of living in alignment with reality is learning how to witness reality from a neutral place. And I mean this in the kind of like as neutral as we can be in any given time. And I mean this in a we are going to have to practice this over and over and over again. Because again, we are humans who have meaning-making machines that go on and on and on in their meaning-making. So when, like we were talking about in the last video, we're questioning, where did my ideas of good come from? Where did my ideas of bad come from? Where did my ideas of right? Where did my ideas of wrong come from? What if all of these parts of myself are actually good? What do I need right now? What do I want right now? What's working? What's not working? What's hurting? What's not hurting? What in society maybe isn't right? What needs might I have that I've never seen anyone have before, that I've never acknowledged in myself, and how can I start to meet them? When we're looking at all of this information, our minds are going to have stories about what all of it means, right? Like, if I need this thing and I've never seen anyone, that means I'll never be able to figure it out. Or even if I figure it out, I'll never be able to get it. Or if I discover that this is an inherent part of me, then I'm letting go of this whole future that I had hoped for myself that is probably never going to be possible. If I'm whatever it is. Usually when we are observing reality, when we are trying to understand what's happening to us, we have a story attached to what we're seeing and what it means if it's not what we think it is, and what it means if it is some other thing that we really are seeing. We're constantly entering into our relationship with reality with a, I'm gonna look at it, I'm gonna observe it, but I kind of assume I already know that it's good or bad or right or wrong or what it's gonna mean if it is that way. And this is part of the reason why a lot of us struggle with being able to be clear on what we're actually seeing. It's not because we can't see what we need to see. It's not because it's not obvious in some ways what's going on with us, what we're feeling, what the problem is, what we were trained to do that's not correct. Like, we can have these situations where someone who knows us or doesn't even really know us can come into our lives and like automatically like diagnose a problem or like see a thing that we're doing and we're like, holy shit, how did I not see that? And a lot of the time it's, yes, we have our perception machine that's doing its filtering, but the other thing is that we subconsciously and consciously resist seeing things because of what we think it's going to mean to see what we're seeing. We are so resistant to seeing reality for how it actually is when it's different from how we think it is right now. Not because the actual reality in and of itself is even that bad or is actually as hopeless or keeping us stuck or whatever it is as we think it's going to be. We resist it because, again, we have these ideas of what it's going to mean and what's going to happen that make it so that we don't want to see it, right? So as an example, I know a lot of people who are currently being diagnosed with neurodiversity, so autism or ADHD or whatever is going on in their neurochemistry, and they are really struggling to get to a place where they can admit to themselves that it's true. They're doing all the online assessments, they're listening to everyone, and they're talking to other people's stories and all of these things. They're talking to other people, they're listening to other people's stories, they're taking in all this information, they're kind of like having their whole childhoods and their whole lives flash before their eyes. And there's all this evidence to support that they're probably neurodivergent, that they're probably not just not able to let things go, or not just a little sensitive, or not just anxious, and if they do enough therapy or whatever, they'll heal. But it's like this is an inherent part of who they are. And they're gonna have to learn tools to support who they actually are versus continuing to hope that they're going to become something different, right? So there's this fear that when I get this diagnosis, when I get this confirmation that I am actually neurologically different than I thought that I was, that this means I'm never going to have a normal life. All of these things that I'm working for to try to heal and change and fix in myself, I'm never going to heal and change and fix because it's part of who I am. And that means I'm going to be miserable and I'm going to suffer for the rest of my life, because they had this kind of concept in their mind of all of these things that are wrong with them that are part of the neurodiversity if they were to accept the diagnosis. But they see it, and because they've been trained to see it, as bad, as a weakness, right? For instance, like the autistic traits of not being able to easily go with the flow, not being able to socialize normally like everyone else, not like having hypersensitivities, generally having really high anxiety, that these things aren't going to be things that they can then work out of themselves. They've been ostracized because of these things, they've been shamed because of these things, they've been blamed because of these things, and a lot of people come to self-help and self-improvement and all of this work in the hopes that they're going to get rid of these parts of themselves. And there's this fantasy of when I do enough healing and when I do enough therapy and when I do enough self-love and when I do enough personal improvement and growth, I will become this person who doesn't have these things anymore. And there's this idea that that's the only way I can be happy. That's the only way that I can be happy, is if I fix these things in myself. So if I were to accept this diagnosis, that's me accepting that I'm not going to fix these things about myself, and therefore I'm never going to be happy. So a lot of these people that I know, it's just like, it's incredibly obvious to me and to people who are doing assessments for them and all these things. It's like, yeah, you're like really autistic, or you're very classically ADHD or whatever it is. And they were like, oh my God, like this is rocking my world. And it took them like a year to like accept that this might even be a possibility. And from me, for the outside looking in, I'm thinking like, what do you mean? Like that, it's very obvious that this is true about you. But I can see why people are struggling to admit to themselves that it might be true because of what it inherently means to them if it is true. Right? They're losing this hope of, I'm going to become this person who doesn't have these things. And again, there's that initial feeling of, and therefore, I will never be happy. So we're rejecting a reality that has always been what it's been. Because here's the thing, right? When you get a diagnosis of a neurodiversity, you've been that way your whole life. The diagnosis is essentially changing nothing about reality. It's not taking away the hope that you were going to become a different person, because there was never hope that you were going to become a different person. It's not taking away the neurotypical future that you were working towards, because you were never actually working towards that, because it wasn't a possibility. We aren't actually losing anything when we come to terms with reality, except for our fantasies that we were working towards that were never going to be a thing. And in exchange, we get to look at reality for how it actually is. And then we can say, no, you can be neurodivergent and still be happy. There are many, 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 many ways of learning how to support what you actually are, of learning how to set up a lifestyle that works for the you that actually exists. That when you come to terms with the fact that this is who you are, yeah, you're not going to become that neurotypical person, but that does not mean that you aren't going to become somebody who's happy and fulfilled and has a great life. And in fact, now that you accept this thing about you that's always been reality, you now have the power to say, okay, if I'm going to embrace these parts of myself, what do I need to feel better? What do I need to feel good? How can I set up a life that actually works for me? So for me, in my experience, by the time I got diagnosed as autistic, I had already set my life up almost perfectly for someone who was autistic without knowing that I was autistic. Because all I ever did was just say, this is who I am. I don't have a definition for it. I don't have validation for it. No one's told me what this is. This is just who I am, and I can either fight with it for the rest of my life and never get anywhere, or I can accept it for how it is. I can accept myself for how I am, and then set myself up the best I can within that reality. And that's what's actually going to make me happy. So these two different perspectives of like, if I embrace reality for how it is, I'm losing what I thought I was going to have. And I'm gaining a hopelessness because that's not how I thought I was going to make myself happy. Instead of seeing it like this, we want to start saying, no, I'm observing reality for how it actually is. But it doesn't have to mean any of those horrible stories I'm telling myself. Because, again, for most of us, the most empowering thing we're ever going to do is we're going to notice what we're telling ourselves when we witness reality. When we look at how things are, and then we go into that, this means this. This means it's going to be like this forever. That is usually what feels terrible, and that is usually what makes us resist seeing reality for how it is. We aren't able to view it neutrally because we're not able to say, this is how it always was. My fantasy was just a fantasy this entire time. And we're not able to say, the more I embrace reality for how it actually is, the less I am trapped. Everyone seems to think the more I embrace reality for how it actually is, the more I am trapped, because that means it's not how I wanted it to be, and therefore there is nothing else. And we have to be willing to let that go. As people who are going to live in alignment with reality, we have to be willing to be radically humble. That if our version of reality doesn't align with reality, that doesn't mean there's no hope for us. That doesn't mean there's no other solution. If we find out that our fantasy is a fantasy, we need to celebrate that. Because we just came closer to understanding how reality actually works, which therefore gives us the actual power we have. We have to be willing to say, if I find out that reality is different than how I thought it was, I'm not losing the potential I thought I had. That potential never existed. I am not losing anything when I see reality for how it actually is, except for the delusion that my fantasy was ever going to be the way I was going to be happy. And then we settle in to saying, whatever I'm witnessing does not have to mean anything terrible. Whatever stories I'm coming up with right here, right now, about what this means if this is true, if it feels terrible, it's not the whole story. We're starting to get radical with our tools here, because this is the Living in Alignment with Reality course. We're not babysitting ourselves anymore. We're starting to say, whatever my painful story is, that's not reality either. And now from here, I want to embrace reality for how it actually is, because that's where I'm going to find my answers. That's where I'm going to find all the ways to step forward. Because it's only in real reality that we can step forward. We cannot step forward towards a thing that was always a fantasy. So we want to learn how to neutrally observe reality. From saying, okay, I'm going to observe what's actually happening in my relationships, in my jobs, with my feelings, without assuming I know what that means. We give ourselves the benefit of the doubt that the more I am open to seeing reality for how it actually is, the more I relax into that, the more my consciousness is going to expand to understand what to do next. The more I can observe reality for how it actually is, I can grieve the loss of my story. I can grieve the loss of where I thought I was going to go. I can be upset. I can be sad. I can be scared. I can have that whole emotional catharsis. Do that. And then come back to witnessing reality for how it actually is and seeing if we can relax into that. If this is reality, then what? And if it feels terrible, that's not it. And we keep sitting with it until we find a step that helps us move forward. And we're going to do an actual walkthrough meditation of this next time. But for now, understand that when you view reality and it means something terrible to you, that's not reality. The stories we're telling ourselves about what it means if this is really reality, if they feel terrible, there's more to see. It usually doesn't mean what we think it means. And we have to be willing to, again, exist in that, well, I don't know then. If my terrible story isn't true, we have to be willing to accept that. I'm seeing reality. I'm telling myself this terrible story about it. I know that if it feels terrible, it's not true. I might not know what is true. I might not know what to do next. But I'm going to embrace that if it feels terrible, it is not true. And then I'm going to relax into more neutral observation. Okay, if this is what it is, what am I seeing? What am I observing? Because the answers will come from there. We're not losing anything when we come into alignment with real reality. We're gaining our actual power, and we're losing the distraction. There's always a way. And if your story about what reality means right now is painful, it is not true. You must be strong enough to say, this isn't it, and I'm gonna stay open instead of shutting down. Okay? That's neutral observation. I'm seeing it, I'm seeing my terrible story. I'm gonna know that my terrible story isn't true. I'm gonna love myself, comfort myself, whatever I need, and then I'm gonna come back into neutral observation so that I can get my actual power. Okay, so that's that, and we'll talk about it more next week.